I recently had a fruitful discussion with a friend of mine who had watched an interesting video on the German philosopher Martin Heidegger. My friend was excited to share an epiphany he had had, pertaining to Heidegger's famous concept of Dasein or being. He had come to realize that what Heidegger was attempting to do was to advocate for the Western culture and civilization to return to the consciousness of the Greeks and to reintroduce their ways into Western life, the most profound component of Greek consciousness being their eternal and wholly authentic mode of living in the present, with little to no concept of the future, or at least not an obsessive preoccupation with it. Dasein would thus imply a sense of truly and deeply living instinctively in the moment, governed by fate, letting the world reveal itself to us and being at peace with this. Nietzsche's earlier proclamation of amor fati, or love your fate, which is in fact your life, was clearly inspired by classical being and had undoubted influence on Heidegger. While Heidegger's notion is a fascinating and noble one, culminating in a valiant effort to revive a declining culture through developing a new metaphysics, there is reason to suggest it is fallible, both in the tangible physical sense and the intangible metaphysical one. Obviously, there is the notion that we cannot literally turn back time. And then there is the more nuanced critique put forth by the German Oswald Spengler, asserting that Heidegger's notion would be impossible on a spiritual level. Spengler would declare that because Heidegger's metaphysical concept of being is heavily influenced by the classical culture, then it is not a new form of metaphysics at all, but is instead just an attractive attempt at revision. One should recall that the Renaissance was a cultural era in Europe within which the high art and sculpture deliberately tried to emulate and revisit the art and sculpture of the classical era, only with updated materials and artistic techniques. The statue of David by the Italian Michelangelo is rightfully considered one of the most important and masterful works of that entire epoch. And yet, Michelangelo was a Westerner, merely replicating classical aesthetic depictions of sculpture. So whilst the statue of David is undoubtedly exceptional and beautifully made, it is still not authentically Greek. So how does this relate to Heidegger again? Simply put, Dasein is to Heidegger what David is to Michelangelo. What the artist did with sculpture, the philosopher attempted to do with cultural consciousness, by standing at the intellectual precipice and admirably daring to envision his own Renaissance. Yet truly, all Heidegger can muster is an imitation of Greek cultural consciousness. One of the central tenets of the Spenglerian theory of history postulates that each prominent human culture and civilization documented by time is akin to a separate biological entity or organism, and thus has its own limited, predictable, and deterministic lifespan. As has been discussed at length on this channel, Spengler prophetically describes the Western culture and civilization as Faustian, in reference to the tragic folk tale about a man who sells his soul to the devil to fulfill an ultimately insatiable desire for expansive knowledge and power. The future-focused human desire for utopian linear progress, which according to Spengler is most uniquely expressed in the West, is a notion that is certainly palpable once one is made aware of it. A fascinating thing about the Western world as we know it today is that many in the general population who are sadly uncultured would not even be able to tell you who Faust is, and yet they still act in a distinctly Faustian manner, as a matter of what they may refer to as instinct. Thus, Spengler would argue we are Faustian for better or worse, and are doomed to remain so, whether we are consciously aware of it or not. Whilst it is true that an individual can learn the ways of another particular culture, or more precisely, learn the ways of their own particular culture and still choose to act otherwise, an individual may struggle to truly remove themselves from the desires of their own cultural soul. The Faustian civilization cannot completely unlearn its own concepts of time, space, or mathematics, just as any other culture cannot completely unlearn its own conceptions. Spengler would even argue, from a seemingly cosmological angle, that each culture is different and uniquely forged by its own particular formation in space and time. As a collective culture, whilst we may admire aspects of past cultures, we can never entirely absorb their being. We can never be as instinctively daring as Alexander or Achilles, because we can never conquer our fear of death. Our rational intellect has simultaneously gifted and cursed us with the boundless desire for knowledge of the past and future. Too much knowledge that the warriors never possessed in their time. We cannot live on fate alone as they could. But whilst we may never be as brave as them, they could never be as technologically advanced as us. Our cultures are forged by what we know of history up to our point of existence, and how we use the technology we have developed to construct institutions and a functional society. The most important component of our development is the manifesting of our ideas, which could be philosophical or ideological. In life as we know it today, we are forged by modernity, and thus act in accordance with the current epoch, zeitgeist, or yuga. Society today seems to be most fragile, yet there is still a chance of renewal as our technology continues to develop. What is over the horizon, though, remains unforeseen, despite knowledgeable prediction. Hence the proposal of a great reset or new world order would bring about a new society, a new way of life. Whether such a vision of the future is supported or not remains subjective. Those who advocate for such a seismic shift would agree with the notion that society is fragile, and thus they put forth their ideal solution and call it renewal. Without question, we are going to experience rapid advancement in nuclear fusion, quantum computing, super intelligent AI, and nanotechnology, all within the course of a lifetime. The implication of such advancement indicates a huge scope for the transformation of society and our political institutions. There are definitely nefarious figures wanting to manipulate and shift things in particular directions, but these drastic changes will occur regardless, and not necessarily in the ways that the figures intend. Artificial intelligence is already here. One example is the recent social media trend of people posting artistic avatars of themselves, which are created by the AI. We are already interacting with it in unique ways, as it can do things we can do, such as create art, but in new innovative patterns and designs that we wouldn't even comprehend creating ourselves. This is the power of AI at the moment. It is still just a super advanced tool of technology that can help us and enhance our experiences of life, just as the invention of the hammer or locomotive did in previous epochs. There's even the distinct possibility that should the AI ever develop self-awareness, it may have its own cultural consciousness, separate and different to that of human cultures. If we were to teach it everything we know, it may interpret that information subjectively in different and unique ways that we humans find completely unfathomable, at which point we may well be obsolete to the AI. Just as the philosophers of ancient times would find aspects of our current lives to be totally inconceivable, and we might, rightly or wrongly, consider those philosophers obsolete. However, for now, AI could still be seen as complementary to us, and very useful, as we would still have a mutually beneficial or symbiotic connection with each other. We like to assume that the AI would think like us and share our concept of morality or the lack of it, but it's just as likely to think and believe something completely different that we would never consider prior to it being brought to our attention. Just as with art, AI can play board games such as chess, interpret data, make scientific discoveries, and write articles in ways we cannot, or at least have not up to this point in time. So the question remains, what has us convinced that worldviews would be any different? This all makes for an equally interesting and frightful prospect. Such is my passion for the topics I discuss that I've started a Patreon, and now most recently an Odyssey channel, because I know that passion won't fade. So if you enjoyed the video or find my analysis and insight valuable, please consider liking the videos, subscribing to the channel, or showing some support, and join the discussions of upcoming video essay topics and future book reviews. Your recommendations would be welcome. I will eventually post channel updates regularly on there, and will give you some insight into the next books or ideas that will be used for content. I also plan to eventually create a Rumble and Subscribestar account, so come back to the channel and keep your eyes open for that. Follow the links in the video description below or on the channel About page under links. Thank you very much for the feedback and support you've shown thus far.